Hello, hello, hello! Welcome back to part 2 of how Britain's capitalists subdued the common man. In case you missed the first part, I do encourage you to watch that first. But the brief summary is that I talked about the nature of the establishment regime, essentially that it is a managerial bureaucracy on behalf of capitalist interests, and then I talked about the 3 persuasive ways the regime keeps power. These were firstly, boomer truth, the way in which the regime justifies its rule; political kayfabe, the way in which the regime constructs a false hyper-reality around itself to obscure the workings of real power through nonsense ideas such as democracy and popular power; and finally, the general cultural decline, which severely reduces the number of people who would even be capable of posing a challenge to said regime. In this part, I'll talk about the 3 primarily coercive ways: the fight against labour power, the offshoring of the economy, and the unnavigable labyrinth of bureaucracy, which is designed to make things as hard as possible for small businesses without having to resort to outright banning them. And finally, because I don't want to be the dealer of ceaseless black pills, I'll talk about how we might still have a chance in spite of everything. Anyway, enough said, let's get to it. One concept commonly understood by people on the left is the idea of the dynamic equilibrium of the competing power held by labour and capital. The capitalist is incentivized to spend more on labour, wherever that correlates to a greater quality and or quantity of work being done, but is also incentivized to spend less on labour in order to keep costs lower. Usually, it is the latter incentive that is the greater of the two. Meanwhile, the immediate incentive of the labourers is generally to push for higher pay, better conditions, and less work. Naturally, capitalists need labourers to get things done, and labourers benefit from capital as it provides employment, so neither can wholly do away with the other, and both have a level of power over the other. Now, usually a power dispute between labour and power, such as a pay rise, would be negotiated between the labourer or labourers and the enterprise owner or one of their subordinates. But wherever an agreement cannot be reached, such as in the miners' strikes, one might expect the state to intervene or mediate. Alas, as I explained in part 1, the state operates in the interest of the capitalist power factions which prop it up, so one wouldn't expect the state's judgment to be all that favourable to the workers, unless perhaps the government wanted something out of them, such as their votes in the next election. In any case, let's look at how both labour and capital can increase their power in the context of what actually happened, and how the balance was fixed to come down on the side of capital. On the labour side, there are really only 3 ways to increase power. The first and least effective is to petition the government or non-governing political factions. The theory goes that such factions would be strengthened by the support of labour, especially labour organised into guilds or unions, thus would promise or enact policies that benefit labourers in exchange for their support. This obviously has worked in the past, but the problem of today is that the regime is a monolith and every major faction with any degree of institutional power is ultimately on the same team, primarily the side of capitalists. Now, it's only too easy for a political party to betray the labour force and never deliver on promises because, let's face it, for whom else are they going to vote? Certainly, elite backing is vital to the success of any movement, but with our current elites, that's just not going to happen. The second way, which is more effective, is to increase productivity, which is usually done by the improvement or new acquisition of skill. If you can do a better job, a task in higher demand, or simply make more money for your employer in the same amount of time, you become more valuable to them. Thus, you can ask for more in return accordingly, as your employer does not wish to let you go. This is true both on the personal level and on the group level, and in some cases, such as those I talked about in my video on the conservative given, the skill of your group may be something an employer or ruling regime simply cannot say no to. However, even though the capitalists would benefit from employing people of greater skill, skilled people, due to the fact that they have a greater negotiating position, can be seen as a potential threat to the stability and security of the operation. Like I said in part 1, our rulers would rather rule over a weak nation than a strong one, because a weak nation poses less of a threat to their rule. As such, to combat the skill of the common people, the establishment of this regime has intentionally been de-skilling society by failing to provide good education or training. I once again fall on the side of saying that the regime has not been incompetent, but that the incompetence was a lie to mask malice. Obviously, in this case, that's a very bold claim to make, and not one I have peer-reviewed evidence for. However, it does make sense as a theory, and compared to what seems like magical genius of our ancestors, I don't think it's too much of a leap to say that the standards since the Victorian era have been going down, not up. The effect this has, though, is that we have become a less competent nation, thus have less negotiating power as a labour force. The third and final way, most effective of all, is to organise, collectivise and negotiate as one. One man going it alone and trying to negotiate for a better position is unlikely to achieve very much. If he's a highly skilled and sought after worker, then great, but many people work as unskilled labourers or low-skilled labourers, which means they are easily replaceable. If these people try to negotiate alone, the most likely outcome is that they'll be told to shut up and deal with it, or simply be fired. However, if instead it's 80% of your workforce negotiating as a single workers' union, then you're forced to pay attention. A union, if it stays strong, can cause serious disruption and even bring a nation to its knees. However, I'm sure I do not need to tell you this, but clearly the unions of the past did not win. Under successive British governments, but especially those of Margaret Thatcher, the state deployed many different union-busting tactics to infiltrate, undermine, disrupt, and ultimately destroy the power of the unions. When it came down to it, the state realised that there was a way in which the union members could be ignored, and many of their old jobs simply do not exist anymore, something I'll talk about shortly. Before I do though, I need to touch on the way in which capital can increase its power. The primary way that capital can increase power over labour is, as I have hinted, through the ability to replace the workers. If a worker is irreplaceable, they can demand anything up to the point of becoming a net cost. If, however, they can be replaced at the drop of a hat, they can't really demand anything at all. Naturally, the best replacement tends to be someone who is looking for a new job, or, better yet for the capitalist, someone who currently has no job at all. To further explain this, the left have the concept of the reserve army of labour. The reserve army of labour essentially means the pool from which capitalists can draw replacement employees. If the reserve army is small, in effect if unemployment is low, then those who are in jobs can more easily negotiate better wages, conditions and workloads, as they are harder to replace. If, however, the reserve army is big, wherein there are masses of people competing against each other for jobs, and whom are ready and willing to accept the existing conditions and pay, or worse, then Labour does not have a strong negotiating position. Historically, things tended to stay reasonably balanced even despite automation, because the total number of possible labourers was limited to the size of the nation. However, with the advent of global exploration, colonial expansion, and the improvement of shipping, the reserve army of labour was no longer limited to one's own nation and the nations immediately surrounding, but had instead expanded to the whole world. Now, through slave labour, indentured servitude, cheap settlement contracts, and general mass migration, the reserve army of labour had grown to the point where the labourers had very little negotiating power at all. Indeed, our modern mass immigration has mostly been an effort to expand the reserve army of labour, in order to destroy the negotiating power of the native working populace. I should also say that, at first, whilst it was typical for men of the West to be reasonably high-skilled, and men of the second and third worlds to be pretty low-skilled, the gradual skilling up of the second and third worlds, something which we in the West often pay for through foreign aid, has meant that the vastly expanded reserve army of labour no longer just applies to the low-skilled professions, but now also applies to higher-skilled professions. This is why, despite constant improvements in technology, the productivity and real earnings of the average British family have been going down, not up. The typical scapegoat blamed by the Western regimes is the 2008 financial crisis, but this is really just a mask used to distract from the fact that real wages are going down because our country is importing loads of cheap labourers. Third world people who often cram 8 or more to an illegally sublet bedroom, or simply break in over the channel and get put up in a 4-star hotel. This is for no reasons other than the pursuit of cheaper wage costs, the disempowerment of labour, and the empowerment of capital and the capitalist establishment. At least when it was only Western European migrants, they expected similar levels of pay and conditions, and it was just as affordable for us to work there. Now we have single male workers coming from Bingy Bongo land, supporting families through remittance that have costs of living over 10 times cheaper than our own. Unless we want to send our wives and children to those cheap third world nations, we simply cannot compete. Worst of all, the government of this country, which is supposed to have our national interests at heart, simply does not care about us. It is an utter disgrace. Okay, I've talked about why petitioning the government doesn't work, why the state is intentionally giving us bad educations that leave us without useful skills, and how the reserve army of labour has been expanded from within our nation of 50-odd million native Brits to the whole bloody world. But I need to return to the issue of striking and the offshoring of the economy. You see, even with the mass immigration and de-skilling, native Brits would still be expected to dominate in the more technical positions. I don't mean the finance roles, which are kept around because they practically are the infrastructure of modern capitalism, but the old manufacturing jobs, the engineering jobs, and anything good that came out of the Industrial Revolution. When these jobs were still around, they needed competent men to fill them, and that level of competence was most easily found from within the nation which had, at the time, the best standards of education: Britain. However, the problem, as the capitalists learned, is that the skilled, competent, hard-working industrial British workforce could and would strike for better pay and better conditions. Naturally, the capitalists still wanted to profit from their technology, and they weren't inclined to shut down shop just like that. So what they did instead was the mass offshoring of industry to places where labour was cheaper and the workers were less likely to complain. To take the example of textiles, a hypothetical British worker could expect at least a minimum wage of £12 an hour for a salary of about £25,000. Meanwhile, a Bangladeshi worker doing the same job with the same tools would only be paid annually about £1,000, 4% of the cost. Even if a company wanted to pay them 25% above local market rates, their wages would still only be 5% of the British minimum. There is no competing with that. Meanwhile, the goods made by Bangladeshi workers can be shipped in huge quantities to be sold here, where they fetch insanely high markups. Even if the British seller does not own the Bangladeshi factory, their markup can be far, far higher than anything they'd get if they made the textiles here. It's mass immigration for the cheap labour of any job that can't be offshored, and it's offshored labour for anything else that can. Now the labour power of the native Brits has been completely circumvented, and there is no risk of striking whatsoever. This isn't just true of goods though. Part of the lesson learned from the miners' strikes is the vulnerability of labour power that comes with domestic energy production. Nowadays, much of the energy we actually use comes from Norway, Belgium, France, America, the Middle East, and more. The state is far less reliant on domestic production and thus is far less vulnerable to potential energy shortages that might arise from energy strikes. This is also true of agriculture, military intelligence, weaponry and defence systems, and even our own nuclear deterrent, which is pretty much bought as a finished product from America. Naturally, this is all a trade-off which has left us vulnerable to the actions of foreign states, but our regime has calculated that we, the native populace, are likely the more pressing threat. This effort has been taken not only to counteract labour power in the sense of labour costs, but also to seriously reduce the risk of uprising. If the native people want to create a rival power faction, there's hardly anything left for them to capture. Practically everything has been sent abroad. Lastly, because I said I would, I'll briefly talk about how bureaucracy counterintuitively helps the capitalist state. Most people would probably assume that bureaucracy can only serve to slow down a system, making it less efficient and thus less profitable. They would of course be totally correct, except for the fact that this is exactly the intention, but it is more deadly to some than it is to others. Let's keep things simple and make the assumption that filling out the paperwork necessary for regulatory compliance costs the same for everyone. In this case, £2 million. If you're Barclays Bank, Marks & Spencer, Costa Coffee or KPMG, £2 million isn't all that much. Sure, it's a pain, but it's one you can easily take. If, however, you are but a local cafe, £2 million is a hell of a lot of money, far more than you can afford. Now, obviously, regulatory costs do change of size, but the point remains that regulatory compliance takes up a lot more costs and time consideration for a small firm than it does for a big firm. As such, the net force is that the big firms, the entrenched powers which fund the regime, are largely unaffected by regulations, whilst those same regulations can cripple a small business as well as make the whole process seem too much of a hassle to even bother with in the first place. The result? Less competition for the big guys. Even when a big firm does fall foul of regulations, such as Volkswagen over Dieselgate or Apple over the throttling of iPhone batteries, they only ever get a slap on the wrist. A small business falling foul of the law, however, is far more likely to be wound up and its founders fined or imprisoned. I should add that the reason why the regime is more comfortable this way is that having fewer large client groups is far easier to deal with than many smaller client groups. It's far easier to negotiate with 100 guys than 10,000. Centralisation, for all its potential economic inefficiency, is a far more manageable way to go about things, and managerial bureaucrats prefer easy management to actual profit seeking. Okay, that's that covered, so how might the common man still have a chance in all of this? Despite all the shenanigans pulled by the state to secure and obfuscate power, there remain a few key vulnerabilities and exploitable realities. The first is that, for all the lies and trickery, there are still enough smart and informed people who operate outside of the establishment regime who work to dispel the lies of said regime, something I'm doing right now. Also, out of a desire to not be seen as repressive, despite clearly being so, the state tends to avoid blatant censorship, hence why I can comfortably say what I am without fear of being kidnapped and silenced, as I might have been in North Korea or the USSR. Also, I should say that the regime tends to think that its position is already so entrenched that people like me could never pose much of a threat in the first place, thus they frankly have no need to censor me. In any case though, especially now with the internet, the states can never have a total monopoly on information, and the truth will always be out there somewhere. This is, of course, a vital first step in getting real change. The desire to not appear repressive is a recurring theme of Western capitalist regimes. The boomer truth I spoke of in part 1, the very way that the regime justifies its rule, preaches the values of tolerance and freedom. If all of that were to pass to the wayside and the regime openly act as a totalitarian state, the stability, economy, support and cooperation with the regime would be severely shaken. As far as the capitalists are concerned, it's simply not worth doing, and it's far better to pretend to be compassionate believers in liberal democracy than be honest about their rule and their intentions. However, of course, this is still a trade-off. The regime's lack of desire to be openly totalitarian leaves open the opportunity to build power in various ways. One such way is what Julius Evola called autarkia. Autarky, means self-reliance. As Evola envisioned it, this wasn't just individual self-reliance, but communal self-reliance. As he saw it, men on the right, or for that matter, men of any persuasion, should build communities, industry, economies, art, networks, and so much more, entirely independent of the state, in a manner that would ideally survive a state attack, which can only be achieved through decentralisation. But also in a way that such communities could survive regime collapse, something which most believers in cyclical history view as likely. Thankfully, through projects like the Beowulf Foundation and their partners and subsidiaries such as Basket Weavers, Shieldings, the Witan and more, the groundwork for autarkia among the true right has been laid and does bear promise. As far as peaceful, non-threatening means go, this is the way. Autarkia is unlikely to ever reach the scale that could rival the capitalist economy, but it can serve as fertile ground to build anew from in the event of collapse or in the face of a new political reality. In the face of the skills collapse, the degeneration of the nation, and the decay of the elites, being part of a fertile and growing organisation of brilliant men and women of the right could mean that people of this group come to dominate in the new regime. However, there is another possible way. This way is less pleasant, more risky, and more likely to fail. The core idea that makes such a way possible is that despite the offshoring of so much industry and services, there are some vital things that cannot be offshored, and some vital positions within these which cannot be replaced. This is the space of the conservative given. At the end of the day, Britain is a real place with real people who do real things. The country needs to be working on at least some basic level for people to actually do anything, which is as true of us as it is of the capitalists, as it is of the ruling regime. As such, these vital industries and services represent major vulnerabilities to the regime. Furthermore, now that so much else has been offshored, the actual remaining size of these vital industries and services is actually quite small. If, say, we could have our guys train up, enter into these vital professions, and then organise and unionise from within, we would have serious negotiating power and simply could not be ignored. Then we would be able to make serious political demands. Not just demands of better pay and whatnot, but of policies, of power, of patronage, and so on. In reality, such an effort, though it may enjoy short-term success, would be very unstable and probably could be dealt with by the regime eventually, as happened with the miners' strikes. I dare say that the regime would be willing to go to great lengths to stay in power, and the combined intelligence and resources of the entire British state could probably outmaneuver a vanguard of right-wing entryists. Still, it is something worth considering, if not as a serious plan of action, then at least as an exercise to better understand true power in the abstract and the actual power of the regime in reality. Other than that though, I am open to suggestions. Anyway, do let me know what you thought of these two videos. I don't profess to have all the answers, but I would like to think that I have the broad picture approximately correct. In other news, I'm happy to announce that I finally have channel membership enabled. If you click the join button, it should show a preview of what tiers are available and what each one gets you. So even if you are just browsing, I would appreciate it if you checked that out. Otherwise, I thank you for watching and hope you have a nice day. Like, subscribe, and remember that failing to plan is planning to fail.